Welcome to Gen Z Hoops, the Gen Z basketball, coaching, and sports business show. On this podcast, you'll learn from professional players, coaches, and executives from all over the world and see the court in a brand new way. And now, joining you courtside, your Gen Z host, John Hartofilis.
Hey, Tim, what's going on?
John, thanks for having me.
Excited to have you on. I mean, you've done some really cool stuff, been learned about some really cool NBA things, and just as fans, it's always fun to talk about that stuff.
As a basketball fan who isn't really angry with me for forever tarnishing their view of the game of basketball, I appreciate you having me on. And any basketball fan that can still be a basketball fan in the same passionate way. You know, you and I are in that boat. A lot of people are very angry with me though for exposing all of basketball's dirty secrets.
That's good though. I want to hear about those dirty secrets. I mean, I don't know. I have fun listening and hearing about those dirty secrets. So, I mean, we can jump right into it. I mean, can you kind of give us some background on who you are, how you got into both the journalism side and getting into exposing those secrets?
So I started out as a freelance journalist for the Post Game, which at the time was a Yahoo site. And the second article I ever got published in 2012 was about Tim Donaghy. And it said in so many words, I believe what Tim Donaghy's saying about the National Basketball Association. I think that this guy was just a very small piece of a very big problem. And from there, I wrote the article, published it, and Tim Donaghy reached out to me and said, thank you so much for writing it. And that's what kind of kicked off this whole odyssey, because I became friends with Tim Donaghy and I started hearing all the NBA's dirty secrets from this corrupt ref who knew all the secrets. And I became convinced that he was lying about some stuff, but all the NBA stuff, the stuff about the inner workings of basketball and how referees manipulated games, I believed what he was saying. And as I got deeper and deeper into it, I believed it more and more. So that's how it all started off, was with an article that I wrote, never expecting to connect with Tim Donaghy, really not expecting anything whatsoever, just wanting to, put my 2 cents out there. And that's what kicked this whole thing off. It's very cool to be where we are today in 2020, to where everybody from coaches and former players to pundits, it's fascinating, John, because it's kind of, everybody knew that this was happening and nobody talked about it. So I hope now that Whistleblower is out, that people can talk about it and acknowledge that this all really happened and it was really bad. And hopefully as basketball fans, we can reach a point where we know that this happened, we know that it's still an issue, and we can keep making the game better and better.
Oh yeah, Whistleblower definitely brought so much attention to what was going on, and there's been obviously so many other things that have also surrounded that. Obviously it's super cool when you write something about someone that you kind of think is untouchable. Like to me, for example, like Tim Donaghy's, like, I mean, I'm a little bit younger. He's always someone I heard about in the past, but it's like this untouchable, like this phantom ref that just like is from like he's mysterious and doesn't exist. And, to have him reach out to you is really cool. What kind of got you to think, okay, let me turn this into a podcast series?
So I originally thought this was a documentary. That was 2014. Podcasts really weren't a thing yet. And Serial, which I don't know if you've listened to it, but Serial is probably the best true crime podcast ever produced by Sarah Koenig and the Adnan Syed murder. And I listened to Serial and I was like, wow, this is actually the perfect way to tell this story, because there's so much nuance there and you really need a narrator to hold your hand through some of this stuff. It really wouldn't work well as a documentary because we're talking about, at times, betting data and just really high level and in-depth concepts that I think you need somebody explaining to you. And so when I listened to that podcast and just from a storytelling standpoint, thought about, wow, okay, with Donaghy, to really get in depth here, it would be highly beneficial to have somebody kind of guiding the audience through all these nuances. And after I listened to Serial, I became just obsessed with making this as a podcast. And it took 6 years. And there were so many points where I thought it was dead. I mean, just I still can't believe it exists today. We're talking November 2020 and it exists, and it's still shake my head every day that it finally does exist, that it's finally part of the conversation and part of the zeitgeist, because I thought this thing for numerous reasons was dead so many times. So it took a long time, but at this point, I'm just really happy that it's out there and that people can listen to it and form their own opinion on whether or not the NBA was a corrupted machine.
It's super interesting to me as to how you thought it was dead so many times, and then I mean, what was the point kind of where it got rolling, where you're like, okay, this thing, like nothing's stopping this thing? How long did that take?
Well, I got to know Donald Albright, who's the president of Tenderfoot TV, and he and I connected in March of 2019. I produced several other sports podcasts, and he and I were, trying to find the right project to work on together. I told him about Donaghy, and just, as something that I was borderline obsessed with and thought was the biggest basketball story that's never been told. And then I believe around this time last year, or maybe, September, October of 2019, Tim Donaghy calls me out of the blue and says, "Hey," because he was he signed a deal to do this as a documentary, and this was years ago, and couldn't do a podcast, and called me and was like, "Hey, that deal expired. Just want to give you the heads up." And the light clicked, and I was like, "Oh my God, Tim Donaghy appears to be open to telling the story as a podcast." And I called Donald. Tenderfoot got behind it. We talked to Tim, and the rest is history.
But yeah, no, at that point, I mean, once you just do it, it just kind of takes a life of its own and just keeps going, which is great. So can you kind of get into that, because it's obviously discussed on the show about in the podcast about how he's kind of like painted as a rogue official, but it was obviously much more than that. Can you kind of go into that difference of what that means? Because that has a lot to do with how the evidence gets put against him, and obviously why he gets convicted and other people don't.
David Stern is such a fascinating character throughout all this. Former NBA commissioner was absolutely brilliant from a business standpoint, and he took the league from league was almost bankrupt in the 80s and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar behemoth. And the NBA is a cash, just a money-making machine these days, and will be for the foreseeable future. So former NBA players and anybody who's involved with basketball loves David Stern because he made him a lot of money. But if you look at how he made them that money objectively, which is what we did, he did a lot of things that I think would be frowned upon ethically, we'll just say. And when it came to Donaghy, one thing that David Stern did, which was absolutely brilliant, was he branded Tim Donaghy as a rogue official, as the guy, the only guy. We have one bad apple. Everything else in the NBA operates with 100% integrity, and this is the one bad guy. He got caught. We're going to make sure that there's never another bad guy, and we're going to get this bad guy out. And the one rogue guy, it just just focus on this one bad guy, right? Don't look at the system. Don't look at this idea that there was something systemically wrong with basketball, with the NBA. Just focus on this one guy. So what he did was brilliant from a branding standpoint, from a PR standpoint. That's what we talk about in Whistleblower, is how the NBA got ahead of this. The NBA, and this still, I think, shocks people when they learn it, but there is an incredible amount of evidence, in my opinion, that suggests that the NBA leaked the story of the Tim Donaghy scandal, the biggest scandal in the league's history. They leaked, in my opinion, leaked the story. And why they do that? To thwart the FBI's investigation, to get out ahead of this thing. And David Stern, before he leaked the story, had his strategy mapped out. I'm going to hold a news conference. This is what I'm going to say. This is how I'm going to position this thing. And it was conducted incredibly well by the NBA. It was just a brilliant strategy by Stern and the league. And they were able to really hush this thing up. And it's taken 13 years now for our podcast to come out and for a lot of the truth to finally come out.
Wow. That's really all I had to say. Like that is, I mean, that is such a strong statement, and it's crazy to think that, because I mean, there's so much evidence going both ways that all that stuff's going on. Can you kind of go into what kind of the evidence is that's pro Tim Donaghy, and then we'll get into some of the stuff that's used against him? It's such a polarizing thing to talk about, that is some of the evidence that you think really strengthens his case.
You got to look at this in two parts. There's the scandal and the conspiracy. When it comes to the scandal, in my opinion, that's, what was Tim Donaghy doing? What was he doing on the court? What was he doing with bettors? Was he fixing games? Was he not fixing games? All that, everything with Tim Donaghy and what he was doing personally, just him, that's the scandal, in my opinion. And then the conspiracy is, what was the NBA doing? What was the government doing? What were these other parties doing to make this thing, and the FBI too, what were they doing to investigate this and ultimately to make it go away? So when it comes to the scandal, there's a lot, what Tim Donaghy was doing was really bad. He was betting on games that he refereed for 4 years, from 2003 to 2007, that we know of, that he admits to. He was doing it with at least two guys, with Jack Kincannon and Jimmy Baba Batista. So he was betting with multiple people on games that he refereed, making an unknown quantity of money. And that's really bad. And that's why Tim Donaghy was so easy to make the scapegoat, to brand as the rogue referee. But then, with Tim Donaghy, when this all came out, Tim Donaghy said, hey, look, what I was doing was bad, but what the NBA is doing is worse. They assign specific referees to the most important games in the league, to the biggest playoff and finals games, to procure an outcome, and that's where we look. That's what we have to look at. That's what nobody until this podcast has looked at, is the idea that the NBA could have potentially been manipulating games throughout its history to make sure that a series goes 5 games instead of 6, and 6 games instead of 7. All the things that, quote, conspiracy theorists have said for years, that the league in a lot of ways is rigged. And I don't think 100% of NBA finals winners over the course of its history, I don't think the league is rigged. I just think that certain games, if you look at certain games and certain outcomes, there are certain games that we can use the word rigged. I think they were rigged. And I think they were because of the system in place. And I think if you look at everything and all the levers in place, I think it's really hard to think that there wasn't manipulation taking place. And so we get into all that in the podcast, but those are the two: the scandal and the conspiracy. So the scandal, what Tim Donaghy did was really bad. The conspiracy, I think that he came out and said a lot of things that are true, and nobody listened to him because of his actions over the course of the scandal.
Super interesting, and definitely the Whistleblower is a great listen to learn all the details of what you just said, because it's a really broad overview to such a complex and difficult to tackle question in terms of, like, because there's so much information to take in. I mean, it's really it's tough to tell, because it's hard to believe him when you take it from the perspective of, oh, he did all that bad stuff beforehand. But then there's so much reason for the NBA to do what they did, because David Stern's been quoted before saying, oh, I'd love a Lakers versus Lakers finals. That'd be ideal, which obviously shows like how much both money it goes into some things like that, and how much better it is for the Lakers to get to the finals than for the Sacramento Kings. There's stuff like that that's pretty glaring.
Yeah, and even just that quote, which was from the Dan Patrick show in, I believe, 2004, just that quote. I mean, how is that quote not in its own brilliant and cunning way manipulating referees? If there's a 50-50 block charge call and the Lakers are playing the Kings the next season in the Western Conference Finals, how does that not influence a referee's decision, right? And really decisions throughout the course of a potential game 6 between a big market team and a small market team. The league had its problems, and David Stern was the puppeteer of all the good things that happened, but in my opinion, all the unethical and potentially fraudulent things that happened too were conducted by the same guy. And that's what makes this story so interesting. So, you can laud him for certain things and you can hate him for certain things, but ultimately there's a lot of moving pieces, and it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray. And to your point, you got to listen to the podcast to really understand, all the different pieces and how it all works together.
Oh, for sure. And obviously we know about everything that happened in the past, but what do you think all this stuff still has any significance today in terms of the stuff that still happened in the league? What do you think?
Yeah, I think Adam Silver's done a great job in cleaning up the game, making refereeing more transparent, in small ways. I mean, there hasn't been a big overhaul, but the 2-minute rule, just in general, again, you're younger than I am, but I don't know a majority of NBA referees. I know Ed Malloy, and I know Tony Brothers, and I know Scott Foster. I know a couple of these guys have been there since the mid-90s, but for the most part, referees are anonymous, as they should be. They're in the shadows, they're in the background, which is a referee's job. And a big, what I'd say the biggest problem in the NBA today, the guy that I really don't trust is Scott Foster. And Scott Foster, I think, is a really bad referee. I think he's, he, as we get into the podcast, was Tim Donaghy's best friend. There's a lot of suspicious activity that he engaged in over the course of the NBA betting scandal that he's never had to answer for. And I think if you look at his actions today and some of the things that he's saying today to players and doing in games and just his general conduct, I don't think there's any reason for us as fans to trust Scott Foster. So, there's still issues in today's game. I think it's gotten better, but there are some things that the NBA can do to clean things up. And one of them would be, I'm not saying you have to fire Scott Foster, but man, if he, talks trash to Chris Paul before game 7 of the opening round series, Thunder's opening round series against the Rockets this year, I mean, that's a problem. That's ridiculous that a referee should be able to do that and not fear any sort of reprimand. And again, we still live in that's still the system where a player can say, can't say anything negative. Player and coaches get fined for speaking up against referees, and that's not America. That's not how this should work. So again, there's just basic improvements we can make, and then some bigger ones too. But it's gotten better. It's got a long way to go.
And it's crazy to think about how there can only be one bad apple. There's no room for two. There's only one rogue left. There can't be. Scott Foster couldn't be included in that because now, okay, was the third, fourth, and fifth one after that? You kind of just want to as a league, you want to limit it to one.
Yep.
So through all, I mean, obviously you were so informed on this whole subject before even doing the podcast, but obviously you spoke to so many people outside of Tim Donaghy during the show. What did you learn over the last few months in recording that?
So much. I mean, there was a lot of games. There's a lot of controversial games in NBA history. One that wasn't even on our radar was the 1993 Western Conference Finals. Game 7 of that series, it was the Sean Kemp and Gary Payton led Sonics versus the Charles Barkley led Phoenix Suns. And so we interviewed George Karl, and he talks about that game in which Phoenix, I believe, shot 64 free throws. And, I think the Sonics shot 36, but George Karl said that he almost got thrown out in the first quarter of that game, that the officiating was so biased and so the foul calls were so bad and it was just so egregious that he, one of the winningest and most respected coaches in NBA history, almost got tossed. And think about that. That's awful. So like games like that popped up on our radar. And what's interesting is, I think a big part of our investigation is looking at specific games, these really controversial games. And a guy who officiated almost every single one of them was Dick Bavetta. And that's the guy that Tim Donaghy says used to brag to other referees about being the NBA's fixer, the NBA's company man, the guy that was assigned to these games to guarantee an outcome. And it's really a shame. And I'd say, we learned a lot over the course of this podcast, but, a lot of these games that I hadn't really looked at until we started production, you're like, holy, this happened. Like these numbers are real. Like these box scores speak for themselves. And, you combine those with the human element. And again, what I say after Whistleblower is, before Whistleblower, anybody who said the NBA could have had a hand in manipulating games was dubbed a conspiracy theorist. And what I say after our podcast is that you can drop the word theorist, that you can drop the word conspiracy. There's no theory here. There was a conspiracy, and it's just a question of how high did it go up? How big was it? And how big was this thing? For me, that's really the question. And at the end of this, I think it's pretty big.
Through all that, do you think we'll ever have a definitive answer?
Never. That's why it's so much fun. NBA referee, do we have a definitive answer on any block charge call in the history of the game? No, right? That every single one is debatable, and the subjectivity of refereeing is, it's part of David Stern's brilliance. Like he knew it's not like it was an umpire calling strikes that were bouncing in the dirt, right? It wasn't even, it's the beauty of sports, right? That so much subjectivity exists. So to answer your question, no, we'll never have a clear answer. And even if, a memo leaked that from David Stern to Adam Silver saying the Lakers have to win game 6 of the 2002 Western Conference Finals, don't forget to tell Dick Bavetta that this needs to happen. And Dick Bavetta said, hey, yeah, everything Tim Donaghy said is true. I was assigned up, there's still be people that deny it. There's still be people that look at that tape and be like, oh, it's just referees made a few bad calls and it is what it is. So yeah, there's never going to be any definitive answers. David Stern was far too shrewd. So it's just going to be a fun debate, which again, hopefully after Whistleblower, now the people that say that there was something fishy going on, that the NBA wasn't on the up and up, can win those arguments. Because at this point, I as somebody who's engaged in those arguments countless times, I know how I feel. We'll put it that way.
That's funny. Imagining an email getting leaked of just like, hey, can you please rig this? It's like, yep, gotcha.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny.
I mean, that's I've thought about that, and David Stern didn't put anything into writing. It's way too smart.
Or still, like, how it's crazy how that still wouldn't be enough to change people's opinions on it, and that's like so incriminating. But people would still deny it. You also brought up a really interesting point that I remember obviously being touched on a lot in the show about how it's not like a ball getting thrown in the dirt and being called a strike. A lot of these fouls are stuff that it's so fluid that you could call it, you couldn't call it, and really no one's gonna bat an eye at it because it's in the flow of the game. That some refs won't call that little bump, others would, and some might, because there's so many small infractions that happen all the time. Can you touch on that a little bit really quickly?
Yeah, it's just basketball. Yeah, I'm sure all your listeners, I would, we're on a basketball podcast. If you ever watched a game of basketball or played a game of basketball, you know that referees are human and they make mistakes, and that there's good ones and bad ones. And it's a hard job. I don't think anybody would deny that. But the subjectivity of the game of basketball makes it extremely easy to manipulate. Everything is a foul, nothing's a foul, right? So if you want to get a star player on the bench in the first 5 minutes of the game, or early in the second quarter, or whenever, can really sway the outcome of a game in the long run, you can do that. Referees have a ton of power, a ton of power. And as Bonzi Wells says, they're the judge and the jury. For a referee to face any sort of reprimand, I mean, the only prevalent example, the only real example of that comes to mind is when Joey Crawford kicked Tim Duncan out of the game for looking at him, and it was all caught on cameras. The NBA had to step in and do something. But for the most part, referees are completely unpoliced. They face no consequences for having a bad game, and they rise up the ranks based on politics. It's not a meritocracy by any means. So again, it just goes back to the system. The system that's in place right now has a lot of holes in it, and hopefully we as fans can demand better and demand more of the league.
Oh yeah, for sure. The subjectivity in basketball is definitely so much different from any other sport, and especially what you're saying about how it's so easy. Like, because getting a foul in the first 3 minutes of the game is no big deal. If Jordan picks up a quick blocking foul in the first 10 minutes, no one's going to say anything. But that second foul can come right after, and that's also kind of normal. But those two fouls change the whole game. Now that he has two fouls in the first few minutes, the whole game's different. So it's such an easy thing to do to pick up two fouls. Also, could be a hard thing depending on just how it's called.
Exactly. Yeah, yep. It's just how the game is.
One last question, just to wrap up. What's next for you? You've obviously had so much success with launching this podcast, and it was many years in the making, and you put a lot of time into it. Now that that's over, what's next?
Right now, looking at a couple different projects. The Astro scandal is something that I think is underreported, and it's obviously very recent, but also some of the big questions that scandal have gone unanswered. I played college baseball. I'm a big baseball fan, and I've already, in my early investigation on that one, I found some really interesting stuff. And then I think there's more. The Donaghy scandal is kind of just the tip of the iceberg for the NBA. There's a lot of shady stuff that happened in the league over the course of many years. So right now I'm looking at both those projects as my next 2021 endeavors, and hope that we can just keep, as sports fans, understanding. I think we have to bring out all the bad stuff so that sports can keep getting better. That's how I'm rationalizing what I do for a living. But I truly believe that. And put it this way, I mean, we uncovered all this about the NBA. Did I stop watching basketball? Of course not. Did I stop playing basketball? No, I got torn Achilles to prove it. So I mean, I love the game. I think it can be better. I think if we continue to expose the past, then the future will be brighter and brighter. So yeah, I appreciate the kind words on Whistleblower, and definitely excited for what's next, and I'll keep you updated.
Awesome. I can't wait to really keep up with your content, because just as mostly a basketball junkie, but a sports fan in general, any way I can learn more about the game and see content that really just teaches me something new, I'll always be there to do that. So no need to question that. So yeah, awesome. Tim, thanks so much for coming on. I mean, I learned so much. I know my listeners did too, and it's obviously one of the most interesting topics is these kind of sports conspiracies. So thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Gen Z Hoops. Make sure to follow, like, and subscribe on Instagram, LinkedIn, and all major social media platforms at Gen Z Hoops. You can tune in and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and every other podcast platform on the planet. Get ready for the next episode.